Section 2, chapters 9 through 12 of The Three Sisters by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 9. Mr. Carteret sat in his study, manfully enduring the pathetic sonata. He was no musician, and he did not certainly know when Alice went wrong. Therefore, except that it had some nasty loud moments, he could not honestly say that the first movement was disturbing. Besides, he had scored. He had made Alice change her tune. Wisdom and patience required that he should be satisfied so far. And, being satisfied, in the sense that he no longer had a grievance, meant that he was very badly bored. He began to fidget. He took his legs out of the fender and put them back again. He shifted his weight from one leg to the other, but without relief. He turned over his Spectator to see what it had to say about the deceased wife's sister bill, and found that he was not interested in what it had to say. He looked at his watch and compared it with the clock, in the faint hope that the clock might be behindhand. The watch and clock both agreed that it was not a minute later than 15 minutes to 10, a whole quarter of an hour before prayer time. There was nothing but prayer time to look forward to. He began to fidget again. He filled his pipe and thought better about smoking it. Then he rang the bell for his glass of water. After more delay than was at all necessary, Essy appeared, bringing the glass of water on a plate. She came in, soft-footed, almost furtive, she who used to enter so suddenly and unabashed. She put the plate down on the roll-top desk and turned softly, furtively away. The Vicar looked up. His eyes were large and blue as suspicion drew in the black of their pupils. "Put it down here," he said, and he indicated the ledge of the bureau. Essy stood still and stared like a half-wild creature in doubt as to its way. She decided to make for the bureau by rounding the roll-top desk on the far side, thus approaching her master from behind. "What are you doing?" said the Vicar. "I said put it down here." Essy turned again and came forward, tilting the plate a little in her nervousness. The large blue eyes, the stern voice fascinated her, frightened her. The Vicar looked at her steadily, remorselessly, as she came. Essy's lowered eyelids had kept the stain of her tears. Her thick brown hair was loose and rumpled under her white cap, but she had put on a clean starched apron. It stood out stiffly, billowing from her waist. Essy had not always been so careless about her hair or so fastidious as to her aprons. There was a little strained droop at the corners of her tender mouth, as if they had been tied with string. Her dark eyes still kept their young largeness and their light, but they looked as if they had been drawn tight with string at their corners too. All these signs the Vicar noted as he stared. And he hated Essy. He hated her for what he saw in her, and for her buxom comeliness, and for the softness of her youth. "Did I hear young Greatorex round at the back door this evening?" he said. Essy started, slanting her plate a little more. "I don't know if I know, sir." "Either you know or you don't know," said the Vicar. "I don't know, I'm sure, sir," said Essy. The Vicar was holding out his hand for his glass of water, and Essy pushed the plate toward him, so blindly and at such a perilous slant that the glass slid and toppled over and broke itself against the Vicar's chair. Essy gave a little frightened cry. "Clever girl. She did that on purpose," said the Vicar to himself. Essy was on her knees beside him, picking up the bits of glass and gathering them in her apron. She was murmuring, "I'll mop it up. I'll mop it up." "That'll do," he said roughly. "That'll do, I tell you. You can go." Essy tried to go, but it was as if her knees had weights on them that fixed her to the floor. Holding up her apron with one hand, she clutched the arm of her master's chair with the other and dragged herself to her feet. "I'll mop it up," she repeated, shamefast. "I told you to go," said the Vicar. "I'll fetch you another glass?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse with the spasm in her throat. "No," said the Vicar. Essy slunk back into her kitchen with terror in her heart. CHAPTER X. Attacca subito l'allegro. Alice had fallen on it suddenly. "I suppose," said Mary, "it's a relief to her to make that row." "It isn't," said Gwenda. "It's torture. That's how she works herself up. She's playing on her own nerves all the time. If she really could play, if she cared about the music, if she cared about anything on earth except She paused. "Molly, it must be awful to be made like that." "Nothing could be worse for her than being shut up here." "I know. Papa's been a frightful fool about her. After all, Molly, what did she do?" "She did what you and I wouldn't have done." "How do you know what you wouldn't have done? How do I know? If we'd been in her place?" "If I'd been in her place I'd have died rather." "How do you know Ally wouldn't rather have died if she could have chosen? She didn't want to fall in love with that young ass Rickards. And I don't see that what she did was so very awful." "She managed to let everybody else see, anyhow." "What if she did? At least she was honest. She went straight for what she wanted. She didn't sneak and scheme to get him from any other girl. And she hadn't a mother to sneak and scheme for her. That's 50 times worse, yet it's done every day, and nobody thinks anything of it." She went on. "Nobody would have thought anything as it was if Papa hadn't been such a frantic fool about it. If he'd had the pluck to stand by her, if he'd kept his head and laughed in their silly faces, instead of grizzling and growling and stampeding out of the parish as if poor Ally had disgraced him." "Well, it isn't a very pleasant thing for the Vicar of the parish." "It wasn't a very pleasant thing for any of us. But it was beastly of him to go back on her like that. And the silliness of it! Caring so frightfully about what people think, and then going on so as to make them think it." "Think what?" "That she really had done something." "Do you suppose they did?" "Yes. You can't blame them. He couldn't have piled it on more if she had. It's enough to make her." "Oh, Gwenda." "It would be his own fault. Just as it's his own fault that he hates her." "He doesn't hate her. He's fond of all of us in his way." "Not of Ally. Don't you know why? He can't look at her without thinking of how awful he is." "And if he is a little, you forget what he's had to go through." "You mean Mummy running away from him?" "Yes. And Mamma's dying. And before that there was Mother." Gwenda raised her head. "He killed Mother." "What do you mean?" "He did. He was told that Mother would die or go mad if she had another baby, and he let her have Ally. No wonder Mummy ran away from him." "Who told you that story?" "Mummy." "It was horrid of her." "Everything poor Mummy did was horrid. It was horrid of her to run away from him, I suppose." "Why did you tell me that? I didn't know it. I'd rather not have known." "Well, now you do know. Perhaps you'll be sorrier for Ally." "I am sorry for Ally. But I'm sorry for Papa too. You're not." "I'd be sorry for him right enough if he wasn't so sorry for himself." "Gwenda, you're awful." "Because I won't waste my pity? Ally's got nothing. He's got everything." "Not what he cares most for." "He cares most for what people think of him. Everybody thought him a good kind husband. Everybody thinks him a good kind father." The music suddenly ceased. A sound of voices came instead of it. "There," said Gwenda. "He's gone in and stopped her." He had, that time. And in the sudden ceasing of the pathetic sonata, the three sisters heard the sound of wheels and the clank of horseshoes striking together. Mr. Greatorex was not yet dead of his pneumonia. The doctor had passed the Vicarage gate. And as he passed he had said to himself, "How execrably she plays." The three sisters waited without a word for the striking of the church clock. XI The church clock struck 10. At the sound of the study bell Essy came into the dining room. Essy was the acolyte of family prayers. Though a Wesleyan, she could not shirk the appointed ceremonial. It was Essy who took the Bible and prayer book from their place on the sideboard under the tea urn and put them on the table, opening them where the Vicar had left a marker the night before. It was Essy who drew back the Vicar's chair from the table and set it ready for him. It was Essy whom he relied on for responses that were responses and not mere mumblings and mutterings. She was Wesleyan, the one faithful, the one devout person in his household. To night there was nothing but a mumbling and a muttering. And that was Mary. She was the only one who was joining in the Lord's Prayer. Essy had failed him. Prayers over, there was nothing to sit up for. All the same, it was Mr. Cartaret's rule to go back into the study and to bore himself again for a whole hour till it was bedtime. He liked to be sure that the doors were all bolted and that everybody else was in bed before he went himself. But to night he had bored himself so badly that the thought of his study was distasteful to him. So he stayed where he was with his family. He believed that he was doing this solely on his family's account. He told himself that it was not right that he should leave the three girls too much to themselves. It did not occur to him that as long as he had had a wife to sit with he hadn't cared how much he had left them. He knew that he had rather liked Mary and Gwendolen when they were little, and though he had found himself liking them less and less as they grew into their teens, he had never troubled to inquire whose fault that was, so certain was he that it couldn't be his. Still less was it his fault if they were savage and inaccessible in their twenties. Of course he didn't mean that Mary was savage and inaccessible. It was Gwendolen that he meant. So, since he couldn't sit there much longer without saying something, he presently addressed himself to Mary. "Any news of Greatorex to day?" "I haven't heard. Shall I ask Essy?" "No," said Mr. Cartaret, so abruptly that Mary looked at him. "He was worse yesterday," said Gwenda. They all looked at Gwenda. "Who told you that?" said Mr. Cartaret, by way of saying something. "Mrs. Gale." "When did she tell you?" "Yesterday, when I was up at the farm." "What were you doing at the farm?" "Nothing. I went to see if I could do anything." She said to herself, "Why does he go on at us like this?" Aloud she said, "It was time some of us went." She had him there. She was always having him. "I shall have to go myself to morrow," he said. "I would if I were you," said Gwenda. "I wonder what Jim Greatorex will do if his father dies." It was Mary who wondered. "He'll get married like a shot," said Alice. "Who to?" said Gwenda. "He can't marry all the girls." She stopped herself. Essy Gale was in the room. 3 months ago Essy had been a servant at the farm where her mother worked once a fortnight. She had come in so quietly that none of them had noticed her. She brought a tray with a fresh glass of water for the Vicar and a glass of milk for Alice. She put it down quietly and slipped out of the room without her customary "Anything more, miss?" and "Good night." "What's the matter with Essy?" Gwenda said. Nobody spoke but Alice, who was saying that she didn't want her milk. More than a year ago Alice had been ordered milk for her anæmia. She had milk at 11, milk at her midday dinner, milk for supper, and milk last thing at night. She did not like milk, but she liked being ordered it. Generally she would sit and drink it, in the face of her family, pathetically, with little struggling gulps. She took a half voluptuous, half vindictive pleasure in her anæmia. She knew that it made her sisters sorry for her and that it annoyed her father. Now she declared that she wasn't feeling well and that she didn't want her milk. "In that case," said Mr. Cartaret, "you had better go to bed." Alice went, raising her white arms and rubbing her eyes along the back of her hands, like a child dropping with sleep. One after another they rose and followed her. At the half landing 5 steep stairs and a recess of the wall led aside to the door of Essy's bedroom. There Gwenda stopped and listened. A sound of stifled crying came from the room. Gwenda went up to the door and knocked. "Essy, are you in bed?" A pause. "Yes, miss." "What is it? Are you ill?" No answer. "Is there anything wrong?" A longer pause. "I've got the face ache." "Oh, poor thing. Can I do anything for you?" "Naw, Miss Gwenda, thank you." "Well, call me if I can." But somehow she knew that Essy wouldn't call. She went on, passing her father's door at the stair head. It was shut. She could hear him moving heavily within the room. On the other side of the landing was the room over the study that she shared with Alice. The door stood wide. Alice in her thin nightgown could be seen sitting by the open window. The nightgown, the small, slender body showing through, the hair, plaited for the night, in 2 pigtails that hung forward, one over each small breast, the tired face between the parted hair, made Alice look childlike and pathetic. Gwendolen had a pang of compassion. "Dear lamb," she said, "that isn't any good. Fresh air won't do it. You'd much better wait till Papa gets a cold. Then you can catch it." "It'll be his fault anyway," said Alice. "Serve him jolly well right if I get pneumonia." "Pneumonia doesn't come to those who want it. I wonder what's wrong with Essy." Alice was tired and sullen. "You'd better ask Jim Greatorex," she said. "What do you mean, Ally?" But Ally had set her small face hard. "Can't you be sorry for her?" said Gwenda. "Why should I be sorry for her? She's all right." She had sorrow enough, but none to waste on Essy. Essy's way was easy. Essy had only to slink out to the back door and she could have her will. She didn't have to get pneumonia. XII. John Greatorex did not die that night. He had no mind to die. He was a man of stubborn pugnacity and he fought his pneumonia. The long gray house at Upthorne looks over the marshes of the high land above Garth. It stands alone, cut off by the marshes from the network of gray walls that links the village to the hill farms. The light in its upper window burned till dawn, a sign to the brooding and solitary land. Up there, in the low room with its sunken ceiling, John Greatorex lay in the big bed and rallied a little as the clean air from the moors lapped him like water. For the doctor had thrown open all the windows of the house before he left. Presently Mrs. Gale, the untrained village nurse, would come and shut them in terror, and John Greatorex's pneumonia would get the upper hand. That was how the fight went on, with Stephen Rowcliffe on John Greatorex's side and Mrs. Gale for the pneumonia. It was 10-1 against John Greatorex and the doctor, but John Greatorex was most of the time unconscious and the doctor called but once or twice a day, while Mrs. Gale was always there to shut the windows as fast as he opened them. In the length and breadth of the Dale there wasn't another woman who would not have done the same. She was secure from criticism. If she didn't know how to nurse pneumonia, who did? Seeing that her own husband had died of it. Young Rowcliffe was a dalesman and he knew his people. In 6 months his face had grown stiff in the struggle with them. It was making his voice stern and his eyes hard, so that they could see nothing round him but stupidity and distrust and an obstinacy even greater than his own. Nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for it. In his big provincial hospital he had had it practically his own way. He had faced 1,000 horrible and intractable diseases with 1,000 appliances, and with an army of assistants and trained nurses under him. And if in his 5 years' private practice at Leeds he had come to grips with human nature, it had been, at any rate, a fair fight. If his work was harder his responsibility was less. He still had trained nurses under him, and if a case was beyond him there were specialists with whom he could consult. Here he was single handed. He was physician and surgeon and specialist and nurse in one. He had few appliances and no assistant beside naked and primeval nature, the vast high spaces, the clean waters and clean air of the moors. Yet it was precisely these things that his romantic youth had cried for, that solitary combat and communion, that holy and solitary aid. At 30 Rowcliffe was still in his romantic youth. He had all its appearances about him. A life of continual labor and discomfort had kept his body slender, and all the edges of his face, clean shaven except for its little dark mustache, were incomparably firm and clear. His skin was bronzed and reddened by sun and wind. The fine hard mouth under the little dark mustache was not so hard that it could not sometimes be tender. His irreproachable nose escaped the too high curve that would have made it arrogant. And his eyes, keen and hard in movement, by simply keeping quiet under lowered brows, became charged with a curious and engaging pathos. Their pathos had appealed to the little red-haired, pink-skinned, green-eyed nurse who had worked under him in Leeds. She was clever and kind, much too kind, it was supposed, to Rowcliffe. There had been one or two others before the little red-haired nurse, so that though he was growing hard he had not grown bitter. He was not in the least afraid of growing bitter, for he knew that his eyes, as long as he could keep them quiet, would preserve him from all necessity for bitterness. Rowcliffe had always trusted a great deal to his eyes. Because of them he had left several young ladies, his patients, quite heartbroken in Leeds. The young ladies knew nothing about the little red-haired nurse, and had never ceased to wonder why Dr. Rowcliffe did not want to marry them. And Stephen Rowcliffe's eyes, so disastrous to the young ladies in Leeds, saw nobody in Morfe whom he could possibly want to marry. The village of Morfe is built in a square round its green. The doctor's house stands on a plot of rising ground on the north side of the square, and from its front windows young Rowcliffe could see the inhabitants of Morfe coming and going before him as on a stage, and he kept count of them all. There were the 3 middle-aged maiden ladies in the long house on the west side, of whom all he knew was that they ate far too many pikelets and griddle cakes for tea. There were the 2 old ladies in the white house next door, who were always worrying him to sound their chests, one for her lungs and the other for her arteries. In spite of lungs and arteries they were very gay old ladies. The tubes of Rowcliffe's queer, new-fangled stethoscope, appearing out of his coat pocket, sent them into ecstasies of mirth. They always made the same little joke about it. They called the stethoscope his telephone. but of course he didn't want to marry them. There was a very old lady on the east side who had had one stroke and was expecting another every day. There were the two unmarried daughters of a retired manufacturer on the far side of the Green. They were plump and had red cheeks, if he had cared for plumpness and red cheeks, but they had no conversation. The only pretty girl whose prettiness appealed to Rowcliffe had an adenoid mouth which he held to be a drawback. There was the daughter of his predecessor, but she again was well over 40, rigid and melancholy and dry. All these people became visibly excited when they saw young Rowcliffe starting off in his trap and returning. But young Rowcliffe was never excited, never even interested when he saw them. There was nothing about them that appealed to his romantic youth. As for Morfe Manor and Garth Manor and Greffington Hall, they were nearly always empty, so that he had not very much chance of improving his acquaintance there. And he had nothing to hope for from the summer visitors, girls with queer clothes and queer manners and queer accents, bouncing, convivial girls who spread themselves four abreast on the high roads, fat, lazy girls who sat about on the Green, bloused, slouching girls who tramped the dales with knapsacks and no hats. The hard eyes of young Rowcliffe never softened as he looked at the summer visitors. Their behavior irritated him. It reminded him that there were women in the world, and that he missed, quite unbearably at moments, the little red-haired nurse who had been so clever and so kind. Moreover, it offended his romantic youth. The little publicans and shopkeepers of Morfe did not offend it, neither did the peasants and the farmers. They were part of the place. Generations of them had been born in those gray houses, built from the gaunt ribs of the hills, whereas the presence of the summer visitors was an outrage to the silent and solitary country that his instincts inscrutably adored. No wonder that he didn't care to look at them. But one night in September, when the moon was high in the south, as he was driving toward Garth on his way to Upthorne, the eyes of young Rowcliffe were startled out of their aversion by the sudden and incredible appearance of a girl. It was at the bend of the road where Karva lowers its head and sinks back on the moor, and she came swinging up the hill as Rowcliffe's horse scraped his way slowly down it. She was in white (he couldn't have missed her), and she carried herself like a huntress, slender and quick, with high, sharp-pointed breasts. She looked at him as she passed, and her face was wide-eyed and luminous under the moon. Her lips were parted with her speed, so that instinctively his hands tightened on the reins as if he had thought that she was going to speak to him. But of course she did not speak. He looked back and saw her swing off the high road and go up Karva. A flock of mountain sheep started from their couches on the heather and looked at her, and she went driving them before her. They trailed up Karva slowly, in a long line, gray in the moonlight. Their mournful, musical voices came to him from the hill. He saw her again late, incredibly late, that night as the moon swept from the south toward Karva. She was a long way off, coming down from her hill, a white speck on the gray moor. He pulled up his horse and waited below the point where the track she followed struck the high road. He even got out of his trap and examined deliberately his horse's hoofs in turn, spinning out the time. When he heard her he drew himself upright and looked straight at her as she passed him. She flashed by like a huntress, like Artemis carrying the young moon on her forehead. From the turn of her head and the even falling of her feet he felt her unconscious of his existence. And her unconsciousness was hateful to him. It wiped him clean out of the universe of noticeable things. The apparition fairly cried to his romantic youth. And he said to himself, "Who is the strange girl who walks on the moor by herself at night and isn't afraid?" He saw her 3 times after that. Once in the broad daylight on the high road near Morfe, when she passed him with a still more perfect and inimical unconsciousness. Once in the distance on the moor, when he caught her short-skirted and wild, jumping the wide watercourses as they came, evidently under the impression that she was unobserved. And he smiled and said to himself, "She's doing it for fun, pure fun." The 3rd time he came upon her at dawn, with the dew on her skirts and on her hair. She darted away at the clank of his horse's hoofs, half savage, divinely shy. And he said to himself that time, "I'm getting on. She's aware of me all right." She had come down from Karva and he was on his way to Morfe from Upthorne. He had sat up all night with John Greatorex who had died at dawn. The smell of the sick man, and of the bed, and of the low close room was still in his nostrils, and in his ears the sounds of dying and of mourning, and at his heart the oppression he was still young enough to feel it of the secret and abominable things he knew. And in his eyes the unknown girl and her behaviour became suddenly adorable. She was the darting joy and the poignant sweetness, and the sheer extravagant ardour and energy of life. His tempestuously romantic youth rose up and was troubled at the sight of her. And his eyes, that had stared at her in wonder and amusement and inquisitive interest, followed her now with that queer pathos that they had. It was the look that he relied on to move desire in women's eyes. And now it travelled, forlorn and ineffectual, abject almost in its futility, over the gray moor grass where she went. That was on Wednesday, the 14th. On Friday, the 16th, he saw her again at nightfall in the doorway of John Greatorex's house. He had overtaken the cart that was carrying John Greatorex's coffin to Upthorne. Low lighted, the long gray house brooded over the marshes, waiting to be disencumbered of its dead. In the east the broken shoulders of the hills receded, winding with the dale like a coastline of gray cliffs above the mist that was their sea. Tortured, mutilated by the jagged cloud that held her, the moon struggled and tore her way. She lifted and freed herself high and struck the marshes white. Defaced and sinister above her battlements, she looked at the house and made it terrible, moon haunted. Its door, low lighted, stood open to the night. Rowcliffe drew back from the threshold to let a woman pass out. Looking up, he was aware that he had seen her again. He supposed it was the light of that detestable moon that gave her face its queer, morbid whiteness. She went by without seeing him, clenching her hands and carrying her young head high. And he saw that her eyes still held the tears that she was afraid to spill. Mrs. Gale stood behind her with a lamp, lighting her passage. "Who is that young lady?" he asked. "The Vicar's lass, Gwenda." The woman leaned to him and whispered, "She's seen the body." And in the girl's fear and blindness and defiance he saw the pride of her youth beaten and offended by that which it had seen. Out there, in the bridle path leading from the high road to the farm, the cart had stopped. The men were lifting the coffin out, shouldering it, carrying it along. He saw Gwenda Cartaret swerve out of their way. Presently he heard her running down the road. Then he remembered what he had been sent for. He turned his attention to Mrs. Gale. She was a square set, blunt featured woman of 45 or so, who had once been comely like her daughter Essy. Now her soft chin had sagged. In her cheeks the stagnant blood crawled through a network of little veins, and the gloss had gone from her dark hair. Her brown eyes showed a dull defiance and deprecation of the human destiny. "Where is he?" he said. "Up there, in the room with Father." "Been drinking again, or what?" "Naw, Dr. Rawcliffe, 'e 'assn't. I sudn' 'a sent for you all this road for nowt." She drew him into the house place and whispered. "I'm feared 'e'll go all queer in 'is 'ead like. 'E's sot there by the body since yesterday noon. 'E's not taken off 'is breeches for 3 days. 'E cawn't sleep. 'E wunnot eat and 'e wunnot drink. There's work to be done and 'e wunnot lay hand to it. Will you go up to him, Dr. Rawcliffe?" Rowcliffe went up. End of Project Gutenberg, Expatriate in Bangor, Maine